Brookhiser went to work for National Review full-time in 1977 and has been there ever since. He has written for many other magazines, including the New York Observer and the Atlantic Monthly. In 1996, he published his first biography, Founding Father, Rediscovering George Washington. Most recently, he is the author of The Right Time, Right Place, Coming of Age with William F. Buckley, Jr. and the Conservative Movement. Today he will be speaking on the subject of his upcoming book, James Madison, the Father of American Politics. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Richard Brookhiser.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you all for coming out. This is my first time at the Kirby Center, and I just got a little tour of it before the talk. And I think it's a great thing for Hillsdale students to have this here in Washington. It's a great thing for Hillsdale College to get its profile out and its message out. And it's a great thing for Friends of Hillsdale, because I love Hillsdale, but it's truly one of those places that you can't get there from here, no matter where here is. So for a New Yorker who can just walk over from Union Station, I appreciate the convenience. I'm in the throes of the Madison book. It is not yet done, but what I wanted to do today was just read you the first chapter, which sets it up and gives an overview of what will be the important themes, and also has some local interest. August 24th, 1814, began as a typical summer day in Washington. Bright and cloudless, promising heat and humidity as the day wore on. For years, James Madison, the president, had fled high summer in Washington and other low-lying cities for the healthier air of his inland home in the Virginia Piedmont. But this August, his presence was required in the capital. America had been at war with Britain for 2 years. Mr. Madison's war, he had asked Congress to declare it, had been fought along the Canadian border, against Indians on the frontier, and on the high seas. Now the war was coming home. A week earlier, on August 17th, 20 British ships carrying 4,500 troops had anchored in the Patuxent River in Maryland, only 35 miles away from Washington to the southeast. The president had suggested pelting the enemy from the start with light troops, but nothing was done. The British debarked and made a leisurely stroll up the Maryland countryside, perhaps bound for Baltimore, a booming port, the third largest in America. Secretary of War John Armstrong thought so. They would certainly not come to Washington, he said. What the devil will they do here? No, no, Baltimore's the place, sir. Now the British had made a left turn. Just hours earlier, at midnight, the president had gotten a note from the field. The enemy are in full march for Washington. Destroy the bridges, remove the records. When James Madison had been a congressman, a quarter century earlier, he'd helped move the nation's capital from New York to an undeveloped site on the Potomac. The new capital was still hardly more than a small town, stretching from Rock Creek in the west to Capitol Hill in the east, a ragged arc decorated by a few incongruous public buildings, as if built by ancients or aliens. In the midst of it stood the White House. Madison was the third president to have lived there. John Adams, whom Madison scorned, had spent the dismal last days of his administration in a shell inside a construction site. Thomas Jefferson, whom Madison loved above all men, ran it like a Virginia plantation house. The dinners Jefferson gave for congressmen and diplomats provided good food, excellent wine, and his own sparkling conversation. But they were small affairs, scaled so that the master could shine. Madison was awkward with all but his intimates. One congressman's wife called him a gloomy, stiff creature, but he had the good sense to marry a superb hostess to make up for it. Dolly Madison brightened the White House with dinners and soirees, red velvet curtains and green gilt-edged china, a piano, and a macaw. Now, A little before 8 o'clock in the morning, a message came to this Republican palace from General William Winder, in charge of the city's defense. It was addressed to the Secretary of War, but the President opened it himself. The general wanted advice as fast as possible. Madison mounted his horse and left the White House for Winder's headquarters at the Navy Yard. The Navy Yard was a mile south of town on the eastern branch of the Potomac, now called the Anacostia River. There was a bridge there, about where the 11th Street Bridge is now. All morning, officers and cabinet secretaries came and went. The three most important represented all the types that a president typically finds about him in moments of crisis. Men who might help, men who won't, and men who can't. James Monroe, Secretary of State, had sent the midnight warning about the British march. A fellow Virginian, he had known Madison for decades. He had quarreled with him and reconciled with him. He had talent and energy, and he had decided to serve Madison. John Armstrong had been appointed Secretary of War 6 months after hostilities had begun to retrieve the disasters of an incompetent predecessor. In a year and a half on the job, he'd cleared out dead wood and promoted fresh faces. But he had also fallen out with the president. He had talent and energy and had decided by August 1814 to use neither in Madison's behalf. Both Monroe and Armstrong were Revolutionary War veterans. William Winder, a 39-year-old former lawyer, had been in the Army for 2 years and was assigned to defend the Capitol in July, largely because he was the governor of Maryland's nephew. He had been unceasingly busy. The innumerably multiplied orders, letters, consultations, and demands which crowded upon me can more easily be conceived than described, he wrote. Yet he had accomplished nothing. He had energy and no talent at all. The British were making for Bladensburg, Maryland, a village northeast of the capital. There was a gap in the hills there and a short bridge over the eastern branch 5 miles up from the Navy Yard, where the stream is narrow. It was the natural route for anyone invading Washington from the east to take. Monroe rode off to alert whatever American troops were already there. Winder followed with reinforcements. Armstrong, who came to the Navy Yard late, was asked if he had any advice to give. He didn't, but added that since the battle would be between American militia and British regulars, the former would be beaten. Madison suggested that Armstrong really should take part in the coming engagement. I expressed to him my concern and surprise at the reserve he showed, was how Madison recalled it. Armstrong added that if Madison thought it proper, he would go off to Bladensburg too. The president borrowed a set of pistols, and since his horse suddenly went lame, a second mount, and decided to ride to Bladensburg himself with his Attorney General Richard Rush. James Madison was 63 years old. He had never heard a shot fired in anger. He was a small man, just over 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds, and a sickly one. All his life, he was subject to what he called bilious attacks, upset stomach and bowels, and less often attacks resembling epilepsy and suspending the intellectual functions. He had talent and energy in spades. He was smarter than Monroe, Armstrong, and Winder put together, smarter than Jefferson, perhaps even smarter than Adams. He put his mind, forget his shoulder, to the wheel, driving himself so hard that he often undermined his already not robust constitution. But he was not a warrior. The day war was declared, he'd made himself ridiculous by visiting the War and Navy departments in a little round hat and huge cockade, a rare violation of his nature. It is arguable, and some of his contemporaries argued it, Madison, said Representative John Calhoun, lacked the commanding talents, that he was not, by nature, an executive. But that morning, he was chief executive and commander-in-chief. War was 5 miles away, and he rode to meet it. He and Rush took the road which is still called Bladensburg Road, overtaking American units as they went. After an hour in the saddle, they came down a hill alongside an orchard and towards the bridge that led over the eastern branch to Bladensburg's main street and its brick houses, when an American horseman waved them back. The President and the Attorney General had ridden ahead of their own front line. The British were already entering the town from the opposite direction. Winder, Monroe, and Armstrong were posted on the hill they had just ascended to the rear. Madison and Rush rode back toward them. It was now about 1 o'clock. There were 7,000 Americans on or near the field, a mixture of militia and regulars, plus 500 sailors who were still marching with cannon from the Navy Yard. The Americans had been arranged in 3 lines, 2 close to the Bladensburg Bridge, a third a mile further back. Monroe had altered some of the dispositions at the last minute, not to advantage. He pulled troops from the orchard out into the fields where they had no cover. Winder was frantic, unable to do anything himself. Madison asked Armstrong if he had done anything. The Secretary of War answered that he had not. I remarked, wrote Madison, that he might offer some advice. Armstrong was not the only passive-aggressive personality outside Bladensburg that morning. The 2 men rode up to Winder. Muskets and artillery were already firing back and forth across the stream. At the racket, the President's borrowed horse reared and plunged so that Madison could not join the conversation. When the Secretary of War and the General were done speaking, Madison asked Armstrong if he had offered any advice. Armstrong replied that he hadn't, and that the arrangements appeared to be as good as circumstances admitted. What John Armstrong said was true. The American arrangements for the Battle of Bladensburg were as good as the circumstances, which included the abilities and deficiencies of the commanders and the abilities and deficiencies of the man who had given them their jobs and kept them there, admitted. The charm was wound up. Now the battle for the capital would play out. The courage James Madison showed on the morning of the Battle of Bladensburg is what first prompted me to write about him. It was moral courage, even more than physical. On a bad day that was about to get worse, he chose to see what was happening and to face the consequences of his actions. But the War of 1812 is not what people most associate with Madison. That is his role in producing the Constitution. Madison was called the father of the Constitution during his lifetime, and he has borne the title ever since. It's a misleading title if taken too bluntly. Madison was only one of 7 Virginia delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, one of 55 overall, and did not get exactly the document he wanted. As the convention wrapped up, he worried in a letter to his friend Jefferson in Paris that the Constitution might not answer its national object, nor present the local mischiefs which everywhere excite disgust. Other men, besides Madison, made essential contributions. The Constitution was written in its final form by Gouverneur Morris, the peg-legged delegate from Pennsylvania. A better choice for a draftsman, said Madison, could not have been made. Some of Madison's greatest writing went into his arguments for the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, but the impresario of that project was Alexander Hamilton, who picked the authors, Madison and John Jay, in addition to himself, and wrote 3/5 of the 85 papers. The strongest argument for the Constitution was the presence of George Washington at the convention and his quiet support afterwards. Madison understood that Washington was the heavyweight champion of American public life, which is why he stuck by him like a trainer from the planning stages of the convention through the early days of Washington's presidency. Finally, the resistance of the Constitution's opponents, like Madison's enemy, Patrick Henry, obliged the Constitution's supporters to offer something that they, as authors, had neglected to provide, a Bill of Rights. But only Madison played a central role at every stage in the Constitution's birth. He was present before, at, and after the creation. He was a delegate to the Annapolis Convention of 1786, which called for the convention in Philadelphia a year later. When the Philadelphia Convention met in 1787, he arrived, the first out-of-towner to show up with an agenda in mind. He never missed a session, and he spoke more often than any other delegate except the flashy Morris and James Wilson, another Pennsylvanian. He always comes forward, wrote William Pierce of Georgia, the best informed man on any point in debate. Thanks to the Federalist Papers, published in New York, he was a player in the fight for ratification in that state, and he led the pro-Constitution forces in Virginia. Political reality and Jefferson's urging persuaded Madison to accept the idea of a Bill of Rights, and as a member of the first Congress, he threw himself into that project with characteristic energy, sorting the proposals of earnest idealists and secret saboteurs into something like the first 10 amendments we have today, plus Amendment 27, proposed in 1789 but not ratified until 1992. He was, finally, the first historian of the Constitutional Convention, determined to preserve the process, the principles, the reasons, and the anticipations of the framers. He posted himself every day in front of the head table in Independence Hall. In this favorable position for hearing all that passed, I noted what was read from the chair or spoken by the members, and losing not a moment unnecessarily between the adjournment and reassembling of the convention, I was enabled to write out my daily notes. Madison's notes, the most complete set left by any delegate, have been grist for later historians ever since. Madison earned his paternity of the Constitution. He was a devoted and anxious parent, for he believed that the happiness of a people, great even in its infancy, and possibly the cause of liberty throughout the world, were staked on what he and his colleagues had made. The Constitution was not the only subject that engrossed Madison's relentless mind, however, and the late 1780s were not his only active years. He was a precocious young man, and like many hypochondriacs, he lived to be a very old one, and he devoted his long adulthood to analyzing the cause of liberty. In 1776, age 25, he led the fight to amend the Virginia Declaration of Right from guaranteeing fullest toleration of religion to free exercise. Toleration is a gift. Truly free men exercise their rights. Madison's statement of principle was enacted into law by the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, written by Jefferson, who was so proud of it that he mentioned it on his tombstone. But it was Madison who got Jefferson's law through the Virginia Assembly. I flatter myself, Madison wrote Jefferson afterwards, that we have extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind. In 1791, after the Constitution was ratified, Madison sat down to rethink some of the most important debates he had just won. In the Federalist, he'd argued that the very size of the United States would buttress liberty, since malign factions could not seize power in such a dispersed country. But he had also argued that another guarantee was necessary: enlightened public opinion. In a new series of essays, published like the Federalist in the newspapers, he teased out the consequences of this idea. Drowning in poll data, we understand the importance of public opinion, though we often doubt how enlightened it is. But in the early 1790s, regularly consulting public opinion was a new concept. Many of Madison's colleagues, including Washington and Hamilton, had little use for it. They thought the people should rule when they voted, then let the victors do their best until the next election. Madison glimpsed our world before it existed. Madison was consumed with questions of war and peace. He had to be. The Bastille fell during his first year in the First Congress, and the wars touched off by the French Revolution continued through the War of 1812. The United States began its national life in the shadow of a world war, as violent as World Wars I and II, longer than both of them put together, and as ideological as the Cold War. It was ironic that Madison asked for war in 1812 and found himself on a battlefield 2 years later. He feared war as the enemy of liberty and had tried, as Jefferson's Secretary of State, then as President, to avoid it. Surely, he believed, trade was a more powerful weapon than arms. Yet, when he felt America's honor was compromised, he chose war. Both his attitudes, pacifism and touchiness, wind through later American history. In his long retirement, almost 20 years, Madison grappled with questions of slavery and union. He heard the coming of the Civil War decades before Fort Sumter. His solutions to the problem of slavery were worthless, a pathetic case of intellectual and moral failure. His position on the problem of union would help solve the problem of slavery. But Madison is more than the father of the Constitution or of other intellectual constructs. He is the father of politics. He lived in his head, but his head was always concerned with making his cherished thoughts real. In a free country, the road to reality runs through politics. Madison spent as much time politicking as thinking, and he was equally good at it. He did what came naturally to him: preparation, persuasion, agenda setting, committee work, parliamentary maneuvering. He grew up in a family as large as an oyster bed, good training for a future legislator. He worked at what did not come naturally to him: public speaking, campaigning. His voice was both harsh and weak. Time and again, the note-takers at debates he participated in left blanks in his remarks or simply gave up because Mr. Madison could not be distinctly heard. Yet when circumstances required it, he debated Patrick Henry. He debated James Monroe in the open air in a snowstorm so bitter he got frostbite on his nose. He won both debates. When he found a political chore he absolutely could not do, he was not too proud to work with men or women who could. Dolly Madison was more than a hostess. She was a political wife, America's first, half a campaign tag team, and often the better half. George Clinton, one of Madison's many rivals, was a widower when it came time for them to clash. Madison, wrote one senator, has a wife to aid in his pretensions, whereas Clinton has nothing of female succor on his side. And in these two respects, Mr. M is going greatly ahead of him. Madison worked with Washington, profiting from his charisma and his judgment, and with Hamilton, profiting from his dash when he was not alarmed by it. He worked with Jefferson, visionary philosopher and politician par excellence, for 40 years. He consented to learn something about money from his younger colleague, Albert Gallatin, a Swiss immigrant who spoke with a French accent but knew more about America's finances than most natives. Madison was a great man who was not afraid of assisting or deferring to other great men, another legacy of his tight family life. He also worked with the less than great, hatchet men and gossips, snoops and spies. On one occasion, he turned a blind eye to a mob. They do the work of politics, too. They are part of the game. Madison invented political institutions as lasting as the Constitution. He helped found America's first political party, the Republicans, in the early 1790s. Later, they changed their name to the Democrats. The modern GOP is an unrelated organization who still hold Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners to commemorate their origins. They should know that their party began in 1791 when Madison joined Jefferson on a trip through New York and New England, supposedly collecting biological specimens for the American Philosophical Society, actually collecting allies for themselves. Madison helped found the first party newspaper, the National Gazette. The Nation, the New Republic, National Review, Fox, and MSNBC are latter-day incarnations. He recruited the paper's first editor, Philip Freneau, an old college chum who dabbled in poetry. Jefferson gave Freneau a nominal job as a translator in the State Department, and in his free time, Freneau smacked Hamilton and Washington in prose. Madison's interest in publicity flowed naturally from his interest in public opinion. Such a powerful force could not be allowed to develop randomly or to be molded by liberty's enemies. If enlightened public opinion was a bulwark of freedom, then leaders must labor ceaselessly to enlighten or manipulate it. Madison belonged to an early form of the political machine, the dynasty. America had revolted against George III in the House of Hanover, but the dynastic temptation is always strong. John Adams, second president and the only founder president with sons, saw his eldest, John Quincy Adams, become the 6th president. But the Adamses were unpopular one-termers. Between them stretched the Virginia dynasty, 2 terms of Jefferson, 2 terms of Madison, 2 terms of Monroe, 24 years of government by neighbors and ideological soulmates. One of the iron laws of politics is that what goes around comes around. Throughout his career, Madison was beset by enemies and supposed friends wielding the same dark arts that he practiced. Fortunately for him, he was generally skillful enough to beat them back. But another iron law of politics is that you can't win them all. Heroes can aspire to perfection, especially if they die young, through the purity of an action or a stance. But the long haul of politics takes at least some of the shine off almost everyone. Madison had an unusually good record when it came to winning elections. Not quite so good when it came to sizing up issues and men. And the years would see many achievements as well as rigidities and blunders. We pay much less attention to James Madison, father of politics, than to James Madison, father of the Constitution. That's because politics embarrasses us. Politics is the spectacle on television and YouTube, the daily perp walk on the Huffington Post and the Drudge Report. Surely our founders and framers left us something better, more solid, more inspiring than that. They did, but they all knew, and Madison understood better than any of them, that ideals come to life in dozens of political transactions every day. Some of those transactions aren't pretty. You can understand this and try to work with this knowledge, or you can look away. But ignoring politics will not make it stop. It will simply go on without you, and sooner or later happen to you. Dolly Payne Todd, in the first excitement of meeting a possible suitor, her future husband, told a friend, "The great little Madison had asked to see me this evening." All his life, Madison's acquaintances rang the changes on this contrast. He was a mighty figure and a little guy. The contrast has a moral dimension, too. James Madison was a great man who helped build a republic. He was also an ambitious and sometimes small-bore man who stumped, spoke, counted votes, pulled wires, scratched backs, and stabbed them. He would not be afraid of the contrast, for his deepest thinking told him that the builders of liberty had to know and sometimes use the materials of passion and self-advancement. If war is the continuation of politics by other means, it makes sense to introduce Madison on a battlefield, even a dubious one. Americans ignore him there too, because we divide our wars into 2 categories. Those we look back on as stirring, Washington's crossing, Pickett's charge, D-Day, and those we look back on as unseemly or botched, or both. But our present experience of Afghanistan and Iraq may illuminate the War of 1812. There were miscalculations and disasters in Mr. Madison's war, but there were also moments of valor, discipline, and learning from mistakes, even at Bladensburg. But Madison rode to Bladensburg more than 60 years into his life, 40 years into his career. Let us begin at the beginning. And so when I finish the book, you will be able to read what comes next. Thank you. Now, unlike speakers at the Constitutional Convention or the Virginia Ratifying Convention, I'm to take questions. So we have a microphone, so I'll recognize you and then wait for the man in the back who has the microphone to come. Yes, sir.
In continuing your history of the Battle of Washington, will you speak of the one building that the British decided not to burn?
Oh yes, that was where the models for inventions that had been submitted for patents were stored, And that was in a hotel by Capitol Hill. And the man who was the head of the patent office, the British were about to torch it. And he addressed the commanding officer and said, "You can't do this." And a senior officer was summoned, and he told them that, if they did this, this would be like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. It would go down in history as a great a blow, not just against America, but against human advancement. So that building was spared.
There's
Next.
another story which I tend to believe, which is that the Marine Corps Commandant's headquarters at 8th and I was not burned by the Marines of the British.
I haven't seen that one. If it was a private house, they might have missed it. The sailors did the best job, not the Marines, but the sailors did the best job at Bladensburg. I mentioned those 500 sailors who were marching to the field, and they were the only ones who held to their positions, and they were bayoneted at their guns. I mean, they performed very nobly. And actually, it was Madison's idea to send them there. Their orders were to blow up the bridge, the 11th Street Bridge, and the commander said, "Look, you can have 6 people do that. You don't need 500 people to blow up a bridge. My men want to fight." So Madison said, "Well, come on along then." And they were the only troops who were well disciplined and stuck to their post. There was a question in the back.
Yeah, I asked this question to a number of historians, and we've never really gotten a satisfactory answer. How is it that Madison, who started out as a Hamilton ally, a nationalist, a pro-Constitution, whose only real problem with the Constitution was that there was no negative, no veto on state laws, scant 3 years later, he's an adversary of Hamilton, he's a states' rights advocate, he's almost completely changed his approach to the national government.
Well, that is the $64,000 question about Madison. And his biographers tend to be in 2 camps, and the larger camp, and obviously because if you're devoting time to Madison, you become his ally and his friend, and you want to think well of him in as many ways as possible. So the larger number of them take the view that there is a consistency throughout Madison's career, and we just have to figure out what it is. The smaller group says, well, no, there really isn't that kind of close consistency. And I tend to be in the latter group, but I also say, what's the problem? Look at the man's job. The man was a politician. And politics is always sending you new situations and surprises, and you have to react to them. If Hamilton had laid out a financial program, at the Constitutional Convention, at the time when they were like this, maybe Madison would have become alarmed earlier, but Hamilton hadn't, because why do it? I mean, we're not there yet. But then the Constitution is passed, and then we are there now. So what will our financial program be? Hamilton has his ideas based on his knowledge and his experience. Madison has his own set of ideas based on his own experience, and I would say relative lack of knowledge, but they certainly weren't his own peculiar ideas. They were shared by many of his peers and friends in Virginia. And so the first 2-party system in American history is generated. Also, the French Revolution doesn't begin until 1789. And how do we react to this? It's a new thing. I mean, we're all like scratching our heads about Egypt now, right? Well, this was bigger. I mean, France was one of the superpowers of the world, one of the 2. It was also our ally. It was the only superpower that liked us. And suddenly they have a revolution. So what do we say about that? Is this a great thing? They're getting on board with our ideals and our project, or is this maybe not going to work out so well? And the Founding Fathers split on that question. So I see that the search for consistency and constancy in sort of every jot and tittle of what Madison wrote may be sort of the pursuit of the wrong question. And I don't, although I do see areas of inconsistency, I don't underrate him or downgrade him because of that. I I mean, I disagree with certain policy decisions that he made and certain of his impulses, but I don't knock points off from him very much, if at all, on the question of consistency, because that's what politics is all about. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone. I can hear you, but for C-SPAN, we need to preserve this for the ages. We need to have a microphone. Think of this as James Madison taking notes.
I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on the greatness of Madison relative to the other presidents that have gone to the White House, as far as making an impact on the world, on the country. Like Reagan beat the Ruskies without firing a shot. Washington beat the British.
Mm-hmm.
How would you rate Madison with regard to presidential history?
Well, I think Madison was not by nature an executive. He is by nature a legislator. And that's where his earliest work and his greatest work was done. And I do see a pattern in his presidency. He knows who the screw-ups and the incompetents who are working with him and for him are. He figures that out pretty quickly, and he does get rid of all of them. He ends up getting rid of all of them. He carries some of them for an awful long time. And a friend of mine, Michael Pack, gave me an insight, which he earned an acknowledgement in the book from this. He said, well, that's what legislators do, because the legislator's building a coalition. And every coalition has, idiots and incompetents in it. But each one of them has a vote. They all have a vote. So you have to know how to draw them in and work with them and so on. An executive is interested in doing a job. And so an incompetent is sheer dead weight. And so you're looking for ways, there may be reasons you have these guys, but you're always looking for ways to keep them away from responsibility, to get rid of them, to, shuffle them off to the side. And it takes Madison an awful long, like John Armstrong, who was not the Secretary of War that I mentioned, not an incompetent, but he ends up, just disliking Madison and working and undermining him. So why does Madison keep him so long? Well, that's a good question. Now, having said all that, we do emerge from the War of 1812 as a draw. And since we're the punky second-rate power, and Britain has beaten Napoleon, a draw like that counts as a victory. Tacitus has one of his Germans say that the Romans made a desert and called it peace. Well, Madison made a draw and called it victory. And I think he was entitled to do that. And I think the fact that the United States survived the War of 1812 and emerged at the other end no worse than they'd gone into it. I mean, the final peace terms were status quo ante. It calmed Americans down, because a lot of the rancor of the early republic, I think, was related to a sense of insecurity. Would this new country really work? Would it really survive? And everybody's made very frantic by this. And this affects partisanship, because nobody really believes in his bones that if he loses, he's going to have another chance. Now, we all know that. We all really do know that. If you lose, there's 2 years from now, there's 4 years from now, there's 8 years from now. They didn't, it was the theory, it was in the Constitution, but they didn't really know that. And then finally, thanks in part to Madison, we come out the other end of the War of 1812 in pretty good shape, and Americans, they're relieved for one thing, but it's also like, yeah, we did this. We emerged on the other side. And this is why we have what is called the era of good feelings. And then, of course, we have the run-up to the Civil War. So worse problems come back in different forms. But at least there is a sort of a sense of resolution. And I think Madison deserves some credit for that. Yes, sir. The man in the striped sweater.
Would you talk about the separation of powers issue with regard to the run-up to the war, the tension between the executive and the Congress, who's making the decisions, or whether it's legislation, or
Well, separation of powers was, obviously, it was a topic that engaged Madison's thought for a long time. And I think one of his maybe greatest insights as a political thinker is that the very complication of American politics and political structure is a good thing and will preserve it and strengthen it. And this seemed to fly in the face of the opinion of Montesquieu, who was everybody's favorite political philosopher in America in the late 18th century, and he said republics have to be small. If they're large, they fail. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and that's just the pattern of it. A republic has to be a city-state. And Madison, also Hamilton, but Madison preeminently says no. The fact that we're so big, that there are 13 states, that this is like a continental-sized country, that there are all these different religions, there are all these different, he didn't use the word cultures, but that's what he meant, all these different localities, and the fact that we have different branches of government in the federal level, and the fact that we have state governments against, under or against the federal government. This is a good thing. This strengthens the republic. Okay, now in terms of the War of 1812, Madison has pretty good control over Congress. The war is usually credited to the war hawks, which were the young Turks of the 12th Congress, men like Henry Clay and John Calhoun, who were just getting into national life, Calhoun for the first time. And they want to do something great themselves. It's really a generational thing. Clay gives this very interesting speech about how, the founders, they're still with us, but they're old, and, they're old, he even says weak, I think, but he says we need our own achievements, our own triumphs. It's really a generational thing. But of course, Madison, by this point, Madison also wants it to happen. He's not dragged into war by the war hawks. I think he's every bit as interested in smiting Britain by this point. And also remember, Madison is a lifelong Anglophobe and a lifelong Francophile. And this affects his judgments throughout his career. So it wasn't so much a separation of powers issue as, I think the two factors were a talent deficit. Our senior officers were like broken down revolutionary veterans. And Winfield Scott, who was one of the great military men who came out of this war, he wrote memoirs late in life, and he has delightful descriptions of what the American Army was like in 1811, 1812. And he just had contempt for all his older peers. And he said, and he has this long description, and he says, this shows the danger of letting imbeciles and ignoramuses direct the military of a republic. So there was that problem, and a lot of these guys got cleaned out in the first 6 months because they were just terrible. Then the other problem was money. The Congress had gotten rid of the First Bank of the United States in 1811. This was Hamilton's bank. It had a 20-year charter, came up in 1811. By this time, Madison, who had opposed it, who had fought it tooth and nail, now accepts it as a both constitutional and useful. And his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, really led him to that thought. But there's enough resistance and skepticism in Congress, all of it from his own party, that the bank is not rechartered. So where will the United States be turning for money? There are three options. There's tariff revenues, and there's loans, and there's taxes. Well, we're not going to get many tariff revenues if we go to war against the strongest naval power in the world, which is also our main trading partner. So tariff revenues will go down. Taxes, the Republicans, Madison's party, are the low-tax party, so they're reluctant to raise them. Loans, we no longer have a Bank of the United States, so it becomes harder to raise loans. Also, Federalist bankers who are anti-war are not going to give loans to a Republican administration. It's a real nasty partisan split. So we really, by the end of the war, we're stumbling along broke. I mean, we've got our military in good shape, and it's really effective by the war's end, but thankfully the war ends when it does, or we would truly have, gone on the block because we were out of money. Yes, sir, in the back. Sorry to make you run around.
I was wondering if you had any comments on Madison's later life in terms of the active record of some of his correspondence with Shakespeare and that.
Well, he does make some changes, but I don't think historians do not think he was a big rewriter. They don't take it very seriously. He keeps his convention notes not secret exactly, but he does not publish them throughout his life. He does show them to friends. I mean, he almost certainly shows to Jefferson Hamilton's long 6-hour speech where he called for a president elected for life and senators elected for life, and I'm sure they were passing that back and forth almost like pornography, like look at that. But he's very careful not to reveal his notes, partly because he doesn't want to be embroiled in controversies over what he said. I mean, he said some very anti-states' rights things in Philadelphia himself, and he doesn't want to be, shot at because of those statements of his. But he also understands, as a matter of rhetorical effectiveness, that if these notes are posthumous, if they come out after he's dead, and certainly he realizes at a certain point, I'm one of the last guys left standing. Then by the end, he is the last. He's the last of the framers. And then he knows, well, and after I'm dead, I'll be beyond the last. And these notes will have an even greater impact. So he's very careful to husband them. Now, another set appears in 1821 by one of the Anti-Federalists, Robert Yates, who walked out in the middle of the summer. He was one of 2 New Yorkers. There was Hamilton plus 2 Anti-Federalists. And John Lansing and Robert Yates took off because they thought this was too anti-states' rights, what was happening in Philadelphia. And his notes were published in 1820, and they were probably tampered with, actually. There was Citizen Genet, if that name rings a bell. He married one of George Clinton's daughters. So he's living in New York State, for years after he embroiled American diplomacy in the 1790s. And so he's a Clinton guy, which means he's anti-Madison. So he sort of tweaks some of Madison's remarks in Yates's notes. So Madison is unhappy to have these notes appear, but he will not answer them with his own. And I think he was right, hold them back. They'll have even more effect. Yes, ma'am. Just wait for, here he comes.
Do you have any particular observations about how his years at the College of New Jersey affected his character and his life?
Well, one aspect of his being in this great big family was that he was a great student. Not only was he a great worker with peers, but he was every teacher's favorite student. And he was certainly the favorite student of John Witherspoon, who was the president of the College of New Jersey. And Witherspoon loved to say, and he apparently said it more than once, that Madison was his best student. He never knew him to do a dishonorable or a disagreeable thing. Now, one of the people he said this to was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson loved this story, and he would repeat it to tease Madison. And because he knew that Madison, in private, Madison had a vein of racy talk. He just did, and we have this testified by all kinds of people over the years. And when Madison was a student at Princeton, one thing the kids did is they wrote abusive poems about each other. And it's not, it is very mild stuff by today's standards, but it's like chamber pot jokes and all this kind of 18th century, Tobias Smollett sort of humor. And so Madison would be writing these poems and people would write them back, and it was a student thing. Surely Witherspoon could have known about this, right? But this shows you Madison's ability. He can be the teacher's pet, and then he can turn around and be one of the boys. And then the third fold there is Jefferson repeating this story to embarrass Madison for years. He can also be Jefferson's good friend who doesn't care that his older brother friend is like teasing him constantly. He'll just roll with that. I mean, Madison was a great associate, a great friend to have. He was devoted to his friends, mostly loyal to them, stuck by them. He certainly is loyal to Washington even after Washington cuts him off, because there does come a moment when Washington is fed up with Madison's later politics, and he cuts him off. And they only meet at a few state functions after that. And he just slammed down the gate, and that was it. But Madison never cut Washington off. And when Washington dies, Madison is back in the Virginia Assembly, and he makes the motion. It's very moving. He says, as we were the first to recognize his merits, we will not be the last to regret his passing. And it's an eloquent, impromptu remark that he gives. So he holds on to his affection for Washington even after they've split. Now, the one he doesn't do that with is Hamilton, of course, but that's a whole other question. One more question. Yes, sir.
I have always been stunned by the articulation of Madison in Federalist Papers, calling on history and his understanding of human nature to support his arguments for reform. In terms of human nature, he was forthright expressing concerns about faction. Yet he seems to be, throughout his life, a faction partisan. It's interesting to hear about that tension between his abhorrence and concern about the damage that factionalism can exact on the republic, and yet that partisan part of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is true if you read, Federalist 10 is the classic, but it comes up in other papers. And he really discusses faction as a potential source of real problems, and therefore it has to be managed and controlled. But he does know that factions are going to appear, that they must appear, they're inevitable, and that the only way to prohibit them is to abolish liberty. If you abolish liberty, you'll get rid of factions. But obviously we can't do that. That would be a solution far worse than the disease. So he's almost like a scientist studying germs in a lab, and he's got all these test tubes of the germs, and he's studying them, but he keeps his gloves on. But then, as you say, and as I was trying to argue in this chapter, and we'll be arguing in the book, he's also in the test tubes himself. He's doing it himself. And I have to say, I think, his understanding of this is not static. It develops. And he does see, once Hamilton starts getting his financial program going, and Madison is alarmed by it and alarmed by the fact that Washington is backing it, then he wants to oppose it. He wants to, resist. And so he and Jefferson found a party. Now, their original thought is, well, once we win, the party will wither away, which, of course, it doesn't. But, Madison lives a long life, and he learns, and he goes through things, and he sees the shape that things are taking. And I think it's to his credit that he keeps himself open to learning, and to learning not just from books that he reads, he's a great reader, but also from his own experiences. Here's a guy who's very intellectual, very theoretical, but he's not just going to apply some template that he mastered in 1787 and just try and smack it on everything forever. He's willing, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, to modify it and to, sort of roll with the punches. And I think that speaks to his patience. I think it speaks to his persistence, which is probably what I most admire about him. This is the man who never quits. And if he loses, he'll come back the next day. You know, if you lose a vote, get on the committee to implement the vote. There's hope. You know, or, you know, even if it's worse than that, you can always come back. You can always keep coming back. And he does, and part of what enables him to do it is a willingness to submit his ideas to the test of his life and see, you know, what ensues. Okay, I was told that was the last question, but thank you very much.